So Constanze and Sam, thank you so much. It is now 10:31, and we'll stop no later than 11:45. And before I introduce our guest and guests of honor and the discussion topic, Danielle, without affiliations, could you just read the list of people who accepted? Some are on already. I'm sure a few will be joining in moments. But Danielle, would you be able to read that list so that everybody has an overview of who's with us?
Absolutely, and certainly I won't read any titles, but I will say that we have a great group of new faces, but also TAI board members, senior fellows, contributing editors. So very excited to have you all here. The TAI team here is Jeff Gedman, Charles Davidson, Sean Keeley, Demir Marusik, and Aaron Sibarium. And of course myself, Danielle Desjardins. Then we have Bill Galston, Jenny Nugent, Gabe Schoenfeld, Jack James, Michael Mandelbaum, Craig Kennedy, Alyssa Weiner, Topher Harrison, Cindy Lipsett, Charles Dunst, Monica Ajdam, Larry Diamond, Robert Singh, Giselle Donnelly, Richard Aldis, Alton Fry, Arch Puddington, Franka Sunder, Etienne Sula, Mike Fox, and Catherine Francis. And I also just want to say, for anybody who is looking to ask questions during the discussion, if you could please either send a message in the chat or use the raise hand function. You'll find that if you go to the bottom of the Zoom, click participants, and then on the left-hand side, you should see the raise hand button. And then of course, you're more than welcome to privately chat me if you have any questions or concerns.
Great. Hey, Danielle, thank you so much. And all of you, what a wonderful group and what a privilege. So I'm not going to do long introductions because I think most everybody knows everybody. But I do want to say at the top, thank you, Constanze, who does many things, including her role at Brookings as Senior Fellow, holder of a chair in the name of Henry Kissinger at the Library of Congress. Those of you who have followed her work and Europe know that she wrote for years for the prestigious publication Die Zeit. And she has written and co-authored an important article, I think, for Lawfare with you, Sam, and I'll let you or Constanze say more about you, but I know you as a senior research assistant at Brookings. You have a hand and leg on both sides of the Atlantic. I believe you're an alumnus from the Georgetown Foreign Service School and other important things. But to the matter at hand, Constanze and Sam, you wrote a piece that caught my eye. Many of our participants today have read it. All have been sent it, wherein it was long and detailed, but in my very shorthand, it caught my eye because you said that there's a debate in Germany about how Germany is handling, coping, contending with the virus at the federal level, at the state level, mayors. But you pivoted early and you said, but it's also opened or reopened an interesting and serious debate about the strengths and weaknesses of Germany's constitutional order, federal constitutional order in a time of crisis or in time of national catastrophe. So I thought it'd be really good for us to hear from you about how you came to write the article. Tell us more about what you've advanced in the article, what your current thinking is, you and Sam, and then we would open it up. And I with this group, I have no doubt we would have many questions. So Sam and Constanze, thank you, and Constanze, thank you, and over to you.
Well, first off, thank you so much for inviting us to do this. It's a pleasure and an honor. And I'm finding these Zoom meetings oddly useful and even in some ways somewhat comforting. It's one meets new people in different ways and one sees old friends in different ways. So it's actually kind of fun. And so I'm going to assume that some of you have at least glanced over the article. Don't worry, I'm not going to read it at you. I thought I would sort of briefly reference the main points and then hand over to Sam to do an update on what and how the debate has moved since then. Just by way of background, back in the sort of grayer areas of my past, I actually did go to law school in Germany, and then ended up writing a German doctorate about American constitutional law, more specifically about direct democracy in America, which of course involves studying American state constitutional orders and a lot of American constitutional history. And ever since, I've been fascinated by the question of how our constitutional orders, if you will, our legal domestic operating systems shape our politics, and to some degree, I think also predetermine our ability to have an effective and legitimate foreign and security policy. And I don't need to tell any of you that we're having one of those Germany moments again in the American debate, where we are at the same time the good guys and the bad guys. We're the bad guys, obviously, for never investing enough resources, including financial resources, in Europe. And we're apparently the good guys because we're managing the pandemic right. As far as I'm concerned, neither of those is exactly true. But Sam and I thought it would be useful to take a longer and more detailed look at the constitutional issues raised here, and just to say, look, there is a lot going on here underneath the surface of the German pandemic response that bears looking at, and then makes the answer to the question whether we're getting everything right and how rather more complicated. And the 3 points that we looked at in detail were emergency powers, state order questions, in other words, federalism and separation of powers, and finally the question of the state versus the citizens, in other words, the relationship between the coercive state and the protection of individual rights, particularly in the domain of data privacy and biosurveillance. And I need hardly add that all of this right now is still mixed up with the question of where German politics is heading, the Merkel succession question, and the 4 or 5, depending on how you count, men, most of them from North Rhine-Westphalia, who are trying to succeed her, and in some ways have been thrust into the foreground of this crisis because of their jobs. First and foremost among them, Jens Spahn, the health minister, who has in the candidate race subordinated himself to the minister president, which is something like the governor of North Rhine-Westphalia, Armin Laschet, but who in every other way has played a key role. And the minister president of Bavaria, who is officially absolutely not a candidate, but unofficially very much is. Meanwhile, the two other men in question, Friedrich Merz and Norbert Röttgen, Friedrich Merz actually got the disease early on himself, a mild case, he said. He's been back, but he has a similar problem to Joe Biden, which is that he doesn't have an official role. He's a businessman. He has no platform except his desk at home. And he's been, as far as I can see, almost invisible. And Norbert Röttgen, the well-regarded, and I think for good reason well-regarded, head of the Foreign and Security Policy Committee, I think was never a serious candidate in the sense that he had a chance, and hasn't really been visible in this situation at all. That could change. So briefly, on the point of emergency powers, I think I just want to say, I think the Germans are lucky that their constitutional provisions for emergency powers were inserted as an afterthought in 1968 into the German Basic Law, really because the Allies saw domestic and external threats on the horizon, remember Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and wanted the Germans to, in case something needed to be done, to do it themselves rather than use their own still existing powers to tell West Germany what to do and how to do it. At the same time, remember, there were student protests all over Europe. That was the other reason. Anyway, the ex post facto insertions were drafted with a Soviet attack or student protests in mind, and so don't apply to this pandemic. And I think on the whole, that's probably good, because Emmanuel Macron in France, who has very extensive emergency powers and called and invoked them very early on, I think has not fared well with this. So that's, in other words, that topic, thankfully for the Germans, who were always very nervous about the state of emergency, was shunted aside early on. The more complex issues arise with federalism and separation of powers. Because, as you know, Germany has a very, very federalist constitution. Add that on to the fact that we have a parliamentary rather than a presidential democracy, which means that essentially means that a German chancellor is negotiating all the time with her coalition partner and with the minister presidents of the 16 states. And if she wants to achieve anything in politics, particularly in managing an emergency, she's in permanent negotiation mode. Now, I think that that is actually something that plays to Angela Merkel's strengths. And that is one of the reasons why, after a tremendous amount of early bickering and sort of different minister presidents ordering different things, there was a degree of unity in the German response. But as Sam will tell you shortly, that is looks now like breaking down again as we're moving into a phase of staggered and very careful openings. But there are at the same time movements towards what you could call a centralizing executive. And they're not entirely new, because in many ways in the last 2 decades, the executive has been forced to do, I would say, power grabs by developments such as terrorism, and both of the Islamist kind and of the right-wing extremist kind, where it became clear that the fact that Germany's intelligence, domestic and intelligence and law enforcement agencies were so siloized was actually preventing the pursuit of serious crimes, and in fact preventing dealing with very real threats. The NSU terrorists are a case in point. The Anis Amri case, an Islamist terrorist in Berlin who committed a bloody attack on Breitscheidplatz a couple years ago, are cases in point. And so this was the moment when Jens Spahn, the health minister, came into play, because what happened was a revision of the Federal Infection Protection Act that gives the health minister really remarkable emergency powers in this situation, and that a lot of constitutional scholars object to. I think we're going to see that one play out in the courts. For now, the legislature is playing along. And at the same time, of course, we're seeing the centralizing executive ramp up in the area of economic emergency management with these sweeping salvage measures enacted by the Bundestag a couple weeks ago, which of course are going to have to be executed by the federal and the state bureaucracies. And I think the point that Sam and I want to make here is that this is sort of cementing a larger trend of, if you will, to put it somewhat less academically, a giant sucking sound in the direction of the national executive, and in the direction of the national coercive executive. And if you go ahead to the earlier cases of terrorism, you could add the secret executive to that. And that raises a really interesting and I think crucial constitutional question, which is if that can't be dialed back, if we find that there are reasons why this, because of the imminence of the threat and the potentially catastrophic result of the executive not having these powers in the case of need, then how do you adapt the constitutional order so as to return the legislature and the judiciary to their proper oversight positions? My final point is on individual rights. Germans being legalist and inclined to sue people have been gaily suing the government, both the federal government and the state and local governments, on individual rights cases. There's a whole website called Lex Corona dedicated to these cases. And most of them have been, but not all, have been swatted down so far by the courts on the argument that these infringements on all, whole swath of individual rights, I don't need to explain that to you, were necessary under conditions of an emergency. But as we begin to open up, as we begin to loosen, and as different states adopt different standards, that's going to become more problematic. And that, I think, is where there is going to be a real jurisprudential battleground coming up. The current case that is on everybody's mind is, of course, biosurveillance with the help of tracking apps. The government, and in particular the health minister, had very, shall we say, authoritarian ideas on this. They wanted to have it centralized. They wanted to have it obligatory, compulsory. And there was a very real risk, as data privacy experts quickly objected, of an abuse of these data, not just by the government, but by private actors and by malignant private actors such as hackers. So we're still in the middle of that debate, but it's very clear that we're not going to get out of this now without more coercive and invasive action on the part of the government. And I think we are going to be saddled with these very thorny constitutional problems and political problems for a while to come. And while right now the trust numbers expressed in current German opinion polls basically put Merkel at Ceausescu levels, I mean, these are extraordinary numbers, that is likely to change. And that will again be an opening not just for the legitimate opposition, but for hard right extremists like the AfD. And so I would expect this moment of national unity to not last terribly long. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Sam. Maybe you can take this forward into what the current debates, wherever the current debates are.
Sure, happy to. And first, I just want to say thank you to Jeff. This is really cool to discuss this with all of y'all. So I guess kind of starting off where things are now. So as you kind of have seen probably or read in the paper, the German kind of federal government and the states agreed on the 15th that kind of the earliest opening date for Germany would be on May 4th. And so because of the power sharing arrangement between the states and the federal level, this kind of has to be done in conjunction. So the federal government can't actually tell the states what to do. They have to, they advise policy and the states implement. And so this has kind of led to, as the opening date gets closer, this has led to a bit of kind of interesting kind of regional changes as the constitutional courts kind of awaken a bit as kind of things move out of this panicked moment of the executive. As in one case in Saarland, the constitutional court struck down kind of the May 4th date and said that, because of the conditions we have, that, the state should open up immediately. So that's been kind of an interesting trend to watch too, as kind of Germany moves slowly away from kind of this height of the pandemic to kind of a more normal kind of political and legal environment. And as Constanze mentioned, the kind of complicating factor in all of this when looking at what different minister-president can kind of do in relation to the coronavirus pandemic and lockdowns is the kind of race for the CDU leadership. And so this has led to different kind of figures. So like Armin Laschet, who is openly campaigning for the head of the CDU, or Markus Söder, who is kind of supposedly campaigning or has a secret campaign to try to profile themselves in kind of relation to how they handle lockdowns. And so this led people like Armin Laschet to kind of be more aggressive in pushing for openings, while Markus Söder has traditionally been more aggressive in kind of locking down Bavaria. So the very much complicating factor in all of this, so whereas before, you just had to deal with, the general protocol of Germany opening on May 4th with then 16 different regional kind of variations of how this would happen, is that yesterday, the presidents of the main German kind of health kind of research foundations released a report saying, hey, it's actually too soon to really open the country back up because the infection rate is kind of again reaching this crucial number of 1, above which kind of the disease spreads kind of more rapidly. And so in order to really make an opening of Germany more lasting, we need to continue the lockdowns further than this May 4th date, or kind of basically what we're doing has been for naught. And so if you kind of consider a couple different legal perspectives when looking at the openings, on the one hand, you have kind of the perspective that focuses on the means of, locking down Germany versus kind of the ends, is that, because this moment of the executive was a little bit questionable in how it was achieved, kind of the legal standing was a bit on shakier ground or vaguer ground, you should maybe go ahead and pursue this opening, because actually locking down the country was somewhat uncertain. And so from that perspective, you should pursue kind of a incentive-based opening strategy. So that on the one seems a bit risky to me. The opposite perspective focuses in the end and says that because kind of the German government's central responsibility is to kind of maintain the health of its people, it's actually kind of mandated to take these kind of steps. But at the same time, it's also mandated to state the conditions under which these steps will be alleviated. And so with the report coming, this kind of position paper coming out yesterday saying, we actually do not have the conditions to open Germany back up, because while deaths and kind of cases are going down, the infection rate is increasing. Kind of opening Germany up on the basis of this second kind of legal perspective is much more questionable, because the government is then no longer able to say that we have achieved the conditions that would allow an opening. And so these are the kind of dilemmas with which kind of politicians are now faced in terms of a legal perspective. And I was looking kind of just this morning to see kind of the latest updates, and there are kind of indications that maybe a more kind of incentive-based opening structure is being pursued, because kind of schools and kind of children's Spielplätze, playgrounds are being, Sorry if there's a bit of Denglish kind of going on here. Having read all this in German, it's stuck in my head now in German. So this will all be kind of a mini German lesson as well. So they're kind of they're proceeding with opening schools and playgrounds, and so, but kind of requiring certain social distancing methods to be upheld. And so you can kind of look for, this report and kind of the kind of takeaways from this report to kind of complicate matters in some states, versus as it pertains to kind of how aggressive different minister presidents are as it pertains to opening. And I think, what to me, kind of reading this, going through all this as an American, is most striking is, the implicit comparison it makes to kind of the US response, which we can get into more detail later, but it just shows kind of how a very cautious and kind of concerned kind of federal system will kind of go about adapting to a pandemic and to a crisis like this, kind of how the different levels will cooperate together, how the federal level will advise kind of local levels to best implement policy. And it's really something to keep in mind as we're kind of looking at kind of larger takeaways from this entire kind of pandemic, which is kind of in vogue now, is saying, what does this tell us about ourselves, is to kind of look at Germany and say, okay, based on this response, how can we then reform our own federal system and kind of put in place actual measures that ensure that maybe our response in the future to a pandemic would be less kind of haphazard, or kind of less kind of sclerotic. And so that's kind of my kind of takeaway from this, kind of with one foot on the kind of the American side of the Atlantic, kind of looking over at Germany, kind of stepping back from my kind of role and kind of researching and writing. And kind of with that, we can get into further kind of questions about kind of larger issues that might stick afterwards. Kind of there's an ethical question in terms of kind of how you weigh kind of the value of economic health versus physical or kind of personal health, which I think is incredibly interesting given comments by people like Wolfgang Schäuble, or kind of one of the local mayors of Tübingen, Boris Palmer. But we can kind of save that for the discussion if people are interested. So I guess I'll turn it over to y'all, because I'm very curious to hear kind of what your thoughts are, and then kind of be engaged in a larger discussion on this.
Hey, thank you, Sam, and thank you, Constanze. There's a lot to pull on there in the next 60 minutes. And if I may, I'm going to ask a first question, which is more political than legal, but it's not unrelated. And both of you touched on this as you proceeded. None of this happens in a vacuum. Much of it, if not all of it, is precipitated by the current public health crisis. And Constanze, you mentioned the name Jens Spahn, the health minister. You mentioned that Angela Merkel's popularity has soared. And of course, she is on her way out. And there are figures like Jens Spahn who want to be on their way in. He's, I guess, 40, give or take, ambitious. And I think, but you would know better, is seen as acquitting himself fairly well during this crisis. In speculation, could you, and Sam, if you would like to also tell us a little bit about the standing of someone like Jens Spahn as health minister, how this plays itself out in terms of his political fortunes, and how he sees or is apt to see some of the questions you're addressing?
Well, let me start with that, if I may. Spahn is, like the minister president of Bavaria, officially a non-candidate. And in fact, he has sort of latched himself to Armin Laschet, the minister president of North Rhine-Westphalia, as his number two. Which is interesting because Laschet is one of, I mean, it's an interesting calculus. Laschet is theoretically a really important figure in this fight because the North Rhine-Westphalia is, I think, the single biggest state party grouping of the CDU. And this is a very, very powerful factor in German national politics. But Spahn's personal politics are much more conservative than those of Laschet, who, while a devout Catholic, is a classic liberal Rhinelander in most other ways. Spahn's problem has been that Laschet hasn't been doing very well in campaigning. In particular, he was on one of these national TV chat shows last week on Sunday night, which apparently I didn't watch it. There's only so much I can take. But he apparently did very badly. He got hammered for that performance. And in general, Laschet is seen as somebody who may be slightly out of his depth. He's also been one of those who's tried to be sort of very combative and very forward-leaning in reliberalizing the lockdown in his state. Thereby annoying both the Chancellor and the Bavarian Minister President, who, as I said, is officially a non-candidate, but whose popularity has shot up in the polls. He is now polling, I think, near Angela Merkel or even ahead of her. And so he's treated as a candidate despite his official stance. And I would say that Spahn's performance or Spahn's role in sort of trying to, shall we say, assertively expand his powers, his emergency management powers in this pandemic, is being watched very carefully and with some criticism, particularly by the constitutional lawyers, because the critique is what he's got now. The package of rights that he has now is overbroad and overly vague. And it's not inconceivable that he might end up like Emmanuel Macron in the way that Macron used the emergency powers given to him by the French Constitution. He didn't have to write them, which is the problem with emergency powers is that it tends to personalize power and crisis management. And then if something goes wrong, it's going to be your fault. So I would say that Spahn is playing a risky game by putting himself out there in this way. He's done many things well, but this could also go off the rails at some point, to be watched. Sam, do you want to add something?
Sure. I mean, the couple of things I would add, I mean, again, is just to further underline your point about Spahn's politics being more conservative. I mean, just as a reminder to people, I mean, this is someone who also got kind of upset at the level of English that was spoken in Berlin restaurants. And so you know, his ability to kind of, I mean, his polling numbers are also higher, but his ability to kind of draft behind Laschet and maybe kind of supersede Laschet is potentially there, but it's also questionable kind of whether kind of the changes he would bring from my perspective would be good. So, I mean, the other thing that was very shocking to me is that in kind of the initial proposal for this contact tracing, he actually seemed to be for making kind of downloading an app kind of mandatory for individuals and kind of using kind of compelling telecoms providers to give over data, which is actually kind of out of step with the EU's own legal guidelines for a potential contact tracing app. So I think the potential, I mean, if Spahn is able to come out of this well, the potential from my perspective would be there, but what that would mean for, you know, Germany's relationship with the EU is also somewhat questionable too. So it's just kind of, while it might be there, you kind of wonder what then that would mean down the line if it kind of represents a further move to the right in Germany.
There's Jeff, there's no doubt that Spahn is a highly intelligent and gifted politician. I think this is prime time for him, and this is, I mean, very clearly the biggest test he's had so far.
Okay, thank you, Constanze. Thank you, Sam. So listen, I have Alyssa as first on the list. A couple quick points. If we neglected to read your name at the top, that's my fault. And as I look at the screen, there are a few people who did indeed accept, and my oversight, but everybody is free and invited to speak. Identify yourself when you do. And if you would, do your best to ask one question, not multiple, or, you know, as we know in this business, the one question with 5 parts. Try to move yourself back as best you can. Alyssa?
You got it. Well, first, Jeff, let me just thank you so much for convening this. I really enjoyed reading your paper, Constanze and Sam, and I came to the discussion with a question, and I have, I guess, a 2-part question. I won't say I have 2 questions. I have a 2-part question. They're, like Jeff, they're both political as opposed to legal, although I'm grateful for as much as I learned. So we've been talking about the future of the CDU, how elections for CDU leadership is postponed, and how it's sort of this contest between the presidents of North Rhine-Westphalia and Bavaria. And I'm curious if you'll comment on what the future of the CDU might look like if either leader is at the head, because as you both know, they're very large but very different culturally from what I can understand about Bavaria and West Germany. So the first question is, I came to this discussion was hoping you would sort of comment on that. And then
sure.
As we were talking, and we were talking a lot about this health minister and realizing that he really backs this North Rhine-Westphalia candidate, my question or comment is how the future election will become a referendum on Germany's coronavirus response. If he's out there with publicly saying, you know, restaurants should open, schools should open, playgrounds should open, and there's a relapse, or, you know, we don't know what's going to happen. For Hashem, we would say, I work for AJC. I guess I should have said some background about me. Alyssa Weiner, work in American Jewish Committee. I work on our German Jewish exchange program. So I actually work with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Washington very closely. So I don't work so closely with the CDU, but I'm very interested in the CDU's politics. So those are my questions, the future of the party, and also depending on how the coronavirus response unfolds, how the election will be a referendum on Germany's response to the coronavirus.
Okay, let me give you 2 answers to that, and I'll try and make it short. For one, a really important point is that none of the sort of problems or weaknesses of German politics have gone away. They're just obscured by this exceptional situation. And it is to be expected that they will show up, and that they in many ways will exacerbate and be magnified by this crisis. Yeah, as soon as the moment of unity disappears, and we have precedent for that, we saw something quite similar happen in the course of the migration crisis, where also the Germans at first rallied around the flag, were feeling great about themselves, and then things sort of fell apart. and I think that we will, whoever aspires to the succession of Merkel as the next Chancellor of Germany had better be conscious of this fact. Had better be conscious of the fact that this is not just about getting the country through an exceptional pandemic, but it is about understanding and beginning to address the underlying issues. And part of which is a problematic relationship with the EU, with authoritarian great powers such as Russia or China, and part of which is a deep national divide between the eastern states that joined the country that joined together with West Germany in reunification in 1990, and a party system that to some degree has become dysfunctional. And I think I think particularly CDU leaders need to understand that the current vitamin boost that they're getting in the crisis may be ephemeral. So I think I suspect the person who comes out at the other end of this as the obvious, or as one of several contenders to succeed Angela Merkel, had better show that he, and right now it's all he's, has understood this. So in other words, it's not just about the pandemic, it's also about the underlying conditions. On the future of the CDU, I'm inclined to think that the current moment of national unity obscures the fact that the CDU has some really deep issues. And one of that, again, is having failed to understand for the last 30 years just how deep the fissions were between the West and the East. And part of this was because several of the Eastern German states were, if you will, the fiefdoms of sort of elderly CDU dukes, if you will, sent over to run Saxony in the case of Kurt Biedenkopf, and that I think is something that they have only now begun to understand, and they don't really have an answer for. And it shows in the difficulties that the CDU has had in dealing with the AfD and with the protest on its right wing in the very small but very vocal Werteunion group that is trying to build a bridge for the AfD into the hard right of the CDU. So I am actually not sure that Spahn has paid a lot of attention to this, or that Laschet has paid a lot of attention to this. And frankly, I have to say that of all the candidates there, although I have a great deal of sympathy for Norbert Röttgen because I'm a foreign and security policy wonk myself, I think that Markus Söder of Bavaria, even if I don't quite, I'm not exactly in his political camp, has been the most interesting because he has had some real Pauline conversion moments that have shown up his political talent and his ability to learn. So I would say to you, watch Markus Söder. And I may have to eat my words. Sorry, that was longer than I was intending. I'm willing to go into overtime if people have more questions. I'm not going anywhere.
So it's very good. And let me tell you, I'm getting these chat remarks. I have Jack Janes asking exactly the question that you began to answer. Why not Markus Söder and his prospects? Jack is free to add on. We're waiting to hear Giselle Donnelly. Bear with me for one moment, Giselle. But I also have Larry Diamond in the queue, and it seems somehow related right now. Larry, you can speak for yourself, but you've texted, what about AfD? How do they play this? What do their fortunes look like? Larry, do you want to add to that, or did I adequately summarize your question?
I I would just add, Jeff, if our speakers could speculate on what the drivers or triggers would be for a sharp increase in electoral support for the AFD. Obviously, the disintegration of CDU capacity in the former East German states would be one of them. I'm guessing that a collapse of the German economy would be another, but and the echoes of the past certainly, haunt us all. But anyway, if they could address the whole nexus of questions around the AFD, which seems to me to be, in the near term, the greatest threat to, German democracy.
So Larry, thank you. And before Constanze and Sam, you reply to that, Jack, did I succinctly describe what you were writing me, or would you like to add anything, Jack James? We'll leave it at that right now. Constanze and Sam, please.
Sam, do you want to start with the AFD?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. So, I mean, I think as you've all seen, kind of the AFD so far has not been able to really capitalize on this, though they are very open about being in waiting, looking for an opportunity to. And so if you kind of look at kind of the far right kind of websites, blogs, which I unfortunately do from time to time, because I guess I'm a masochist like that. They are very open about this and kind of, looking for an emergency with which they could use the catapult to greater support. There's a very long kind of article by a guy named Götz Kubitschek, who is kind of the central ideologue of the AFD, or kind of the far right in Germany, who, he railed against the kind of the restrictions on freedom of movement, and in particular the inability rather to go to church for Easter services. He kind of bragged about going to the catacombs for Easter services, and kind of at the same time kind of pushed for civil disobedience and kind of getting people together. Another kind of interesting perspective I saw on that was that this insistence by the AFD on kind of restrictions and kind of personal freedoms is somewhat missed, and they should instead focus on kind of the misuse of emergency clauses and kind of the kind of misbehavior of the federal government. And so I would say, kind of to your point about what will cause this, I think, yes, an economic collapse, or kind of the collapse in GDP, could kind of create a febrile kind of environment in which people will be more receptive to this. But what it looks like the AFD's kind of focuses on is how can they position themselves to be kind of the defender of personal rights in a way, or kind of the defender against kind of the overreaches by the central government. And so in that way, I would kind of look for the way that the AFD is going to position themselves vis-a-vis kind of further lockdowns, vis-a-vis the kind of coronavirus tracing app. I mean, one of the main complaints among people surveyed is about the kind of tracing app, and whether or not they'd be willing to download it, is that they are afraid of government surveillance after the pandemic has ended. And so that would be something that the AFD would look to use to kind of speak to a different audience beyond their kind of sort of hard right base that's kind of largely based in the East right now.
Let me add a couple points on the AFD and then come back to Zuda. The AFD is in a bit of an unfortunate position right now, because while it has been waiting for a moment like this, hoping to exploit the anger, distrust, alienation, and this is, we quoted a Götz Kubitschek piece where that was from 2018, where he was predicting that as the next moment, the next migration crisis, the next moment of opportunity for them. Unfortunately, this has come at a time when that is not perfect for the AFD. For one, the two really important things happened last December, which is that a 5-year-old fight within the AFD was resolved to the benefit of the hard right. In other words, the bourgeois bridge builders like Gauland and Alice Weidel lost power, and Meuthen, the speaker, and they not just, and instead the people who are now in power are the Flügel, the hard right wing, which is led by Björn Höcke from Thuringia and Tino Kruppala. And at the same time, astonishingly, this hard right was able to impose messaging discipline on the rest of the party. That's also something that hasn't happened before. And Meuthen tried to break out a couple weeks ago and was just hammered into the ground for that. Basically, that fight is resolved. And at the same time, of course, that clarifies what the AfD is. Because the Flügel has been very clear about its goals, has been very clear about what it is trying to achieve, which is literally getting rid of what they call the illegitimate system of Germany. And so the German Domestic Intelligence Service, very belatedly in my view, has finally decided to take them under observation. So this is, if you will, the moment when the possibility for the AfD to obfuscate about its intentions is, I think, over. And this sets the scene for real potential conflicts. But they have, as Sam said, not been able to capitalize on this moment. That's not, however, to say that they can't do that in the future. Mm-hmm. Jack, on Söder, I think the interesting thing about Söder is that for the longest time, Söder was something of a laughingstock in national politics. He was seen as somebody who was too big for his britches, who was always raging to get into prime time, but really not ready for it intellectually or in terms of experience. And he was seen as kind of a sort of an, you know, somebody who would always be second rate. And this came to a head when in the Bavarian state election of October 2018, he, in order to fend off a challenge from the AfD, adopted AfD-light positions and got hammered for it brutally in the polls. He lost the most sacred cow of Bavarian politics, which is the absolute majority for the CSU. And in consequence of that, he went through something of a Pauline conversion and decided to take on the AfD head on. And that is what has made his popularity rates go up in his own state. And I think there is, at this point, a national consensus expressed in the national polls that his handling of the crisis in Bavaria, where things have been much more severe than, say, in the north or in the east, not least because of the proximity to Italy and because everybody in Bavaria goes skiing in January and February, and guess where they got infected? In these skiing places in Austria and in Italy, and brought that back. He has been a very circumspect and careful manager of this crisis. And I would remind you, that's my last point, that he has already canceled the Oktoberfest. Which is, if there is a test to a ruler's legitimacy in Bavaria, it's the ability to cancel the Oktoberfest and not be run out of the state. That is billions of income. It's probably the Bavarian tourist industry and to some degree also the Bavarian government is one of their biggest cash cows. And for Bavarians to accept that is truly exceptional and really means that people have decided that he knows what he's doing.
Thank you, Constanze. We're going to move now back. Thank you for your patience, Giselle Donnelly. Giselle?
Giselle?
Everything is harder on telephone. I'm sorry. The
Quite all right.
unmute button is really evasive. So, Constanze and Sam, I'm really struck by the sobriety of your presentation and the absolute love that Angela Merkel gets, particularly from the Democratic Party in the United States. There was a picture a couple of weeks ago of the chancellor in a white lab coat looking through a microscope, and it immediately went viral with Democrats and other liberals in this country saying, boy, I wish we had one of those. She's so dreamy. So I'm just wondering if there isn't possibly going to, I'd actually like you to speculate on the connection between external affairs and this internal set of issues that you were describing. And you have to wonder whether the perception of German success here, particularly if it lasts, and sort of the restoration of the myth of German competence in governing mightn't kick back to help solve some of these underlying issues, or at least kick those cans down the road a bit, so that, and particularly if one contrasts Macron to Merkel, it is a pretty striking contrast again at this moment. So in terms of Germany's confidence in itself and possibly its position in the world, is there a reasonable case for a positive outcome?
A positive outcome for whom, Giselle?
Well, assuming that that the competence is backed, it has some basis in reality, but just in Germany's willingness to play a more, a more traditional leadership role of the kind that many of us have always wished Germany would do.
Yeah, Giselle, that's both a really, really good question and a really hard one to answer. I mean, I think that both Sam and I made it clear that we think that there is a lot of projection going on both Merkel and Germany in general, and in this country, and I think it's being done not just by the Democrats, but also by some Republicans as well, I might argue. Yeah. And I think what we were trying to do was just peel that back and look at the sort of the issues at play in Germany as soberly as we could. I do think that some of her innate qualities that right now are playing to her advantage, that her deliberation, her inclination to negotiate and to build consensus carefully, I think has been very good in bringing together the leaders, the fractious leaders of 16 German states at a really hard time. But luck is also part of this. The Germans had, it has to be said, this is now history, a historically balanced budget and a historical budget surplus. That's all now gone, been blown to the winds. As you know, the Germans even changed their constitution to add a balanced budget obligation, and they blew through that with the emergency salvage legislative package on May 23rd. So she is lucky in that she has this capital to work with. But as we head into a period where the mood becomes more fraught, where the cost of the pandemic and its unequal distribution in society becomes more apparent, and where the divisions in Europe become more apparent, and where you require a both more forceful and more visionary leadership, and one that is also willing to pay a price to keep for unity, not just in Germany but in Europe, we may see her weaknesses again. So I think that we are, to quote her, we are not at the end of this, we are at the end of the beginning. And we've been here before in the migration crisis, we've been here before in the Eurozone crisis. I would expect there to be some troughs in this curve. Yeah, I think that's where we are. I think it's but let me say sort of, because we've all been gingerly tiptoeing around the question, the American question, except for Sam. I think we're also lucky in that we have a constitution that is relatively young, that was built with a catastrophe, a self-inflicted man-made political catastrophe in mind, and that was supposed to make sure to build in so many safeguards that it almost completely hamstrings the central executive, which has been trying to disentangle itself from that in the course of the past decade or two. And I think that part of what America may be grappling with is a sort of constitutional order that has grown over more than 2 centuries, and that is very heavily reliant, because it's a presidential system and because it is an extremely large federalist system, is extremely reliant on the personal qualities of leadership, both at the state level and on the federal level. And that's just less important in the German operating system.
Okay, Constanze and Giselle, thank you. Let me tell you where we are. We've got the 15-minute warning. I have next Mir. Sam, you lean in with a pensive sort of look. And I feel like should we invite you to say something, or you want to hold your fire? But you're free to say something.
No, sure.
Right now.
I think this question of German leadership and Merkel is, it's a huge question. And I think it also is worth kind of looking at kind of the critiques of Merkel that existed before the crisis, and kind of the critiques of Germany that existed before. So, to start off, when you say kind of leadership on a European level, the thing that I think of is kind of this larger solidarity measure, this kind of, if we're going to have Corona bonds or something like that. And so last week, I think it was, kind of time is a bit of a construct now, but I think it was last week, Merkel had this press conference in which she said, okay, we are going to contribute to solidarity measures in the EU above the initial kind of 500 billion that's allocated. And I think some saw this as, this is, Germany is kind of loosening the purse strings, so to say, on kind of what is willing to commit financially. I saw this a little bit more pessimistically, maybe, in terms of Merkel saying, yes, we are then willing to commit more to the EU budget as it's renegotiated for the first few years. Because she also, in almost kind of the same, or one of the next sentences, said, like, whatever kind of solidarity measures we need to do, must be discussed within terms of the kind of the constitutions and treaties that exist. And said that, we can discuss changes to the treaties, but that will take a while. It's not closing the door to those kinds of changes, but it's also kind of, pushing the debate off to another time. And so that's kind of my reason for being a little bit less pessimistic. You can also say that, a major critique of Merkel, outside or kind of from afar, is that she didn't really have a vision for much of kind of Germany and kind of this current role. You then had the critique of this critique that, whoever has visions should go to the doctor. So that kind of stream exists in German political thought. But I would also say, it's the other issue of Merkel is that, viewed from a German political kind of landscape perspective, that she has moved the CDU so much into the center that it's kind of made life difficult for other parties like the SPD. And so whether that really enables kind of the CDU in its current form to continue to exist is also questionable in my mind. And it's kind of led to a lot of the problems that are happening now on kind of the center right in Germany, where you have people who kind of no longer have a political home, so to say. And so you have this kind of flirtation with the AfD, which is, to me, the biggest worry kind of I have with regards to the future of the CDU, the degree to which it might one day work with the AfD in a more formal way than that which you saw in Thüringen which was kind of this weird, maybe coordinated vote. So those are kind of my kind of thoughts that were kind of coming up as Constanze was speaking, and hopefully not to get too much into a debate about, solidarity measures in the EU, but yeah.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Let's take Demir, and then after a reply round, see where we are. I think we would have time for at least one more, and I have one more person on the list. Demir, you first, please.
Thanks, Jeff. Constanze, Sam, really, paper's excellent. I really enjoyed reading it. I think it apart from the German case, I think it has a lot of sort of provocative things in it that I think all of us in democracies have to, I think, grapple with going forward. So it's really useful. If I can ask you both the following question, and this is mostly my own ignorance of Germany, because we're talking about comparative things about the United States and the German situation. Constanze, you mentioned, the differences, a longer sort of tradition here, and the advantages for Germany having a younger constitutional order. Can you speak a little bit about general public opinion towards basic law right now, because the German basic law, because it's a tension in your paper that you're concerned about the possibility of a return to the status quo ante, whether something has shifted fundamentally now. You make a lot of reference to expert opinion and basically the politics of it, but I'm curious if you have a sense of generally what the German attitude, the individual's attitude is, again, compared to the United States. Now, for good or for ill, and this plays out in different ways in American politics, but there's this, at least a sense that the Constitution is it's worshipped as holy writ, and it's very difficult to amend, and it's, obviously there's a lot of political hypocrisy that goes along with that. What struck me also, if you can talk about a bit, is how the AfD, in fact, Sam, I think you mentioned, is exploiting concerns about surveillance and centralization to sort of now try and bolster its image in this sort of almost echo of, the paranoid right-wing ideal here in the United States. We're being spied everywhere. So that's in a sense, paradoxically, if I'm hearing you right, the AfD is now at least positioning itself against an overreach of the federal thing. So I don't know, can you just maybe talk about that a little bit, about German attitudes towards the basic law, the changes that are happening? Has the Overton window shifted? Have circumstances shifted that the public will be quite open to something like that? Can you talk a little bit about on that level? Thanks a lot.
Sam, if I may, I'll take the public opinion part of this. Demir, again, really interesting, complicated question. I am not aware of any polling on this. Yeah, that would be, and having run a GMF poll for myself for 2 years, I'm only too aware of how complex it would be to formulate the right questions to. But I think it's correct to say that Germany doesn't have this culture of constitutional patriotism that America has, and I think you're also entirely correct in saying that comes with the occasional hypocrisy, and has throughout the ages, as a lot of American constitutional historians and others have written. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that Germany's constitution is called the Basic Law because it was supposed to be a transitory document. It's actually not called a constitution because it was at the time supposed to be replaced by something new in case there ever was a reunification. And when we surprisingly got reunification in 1990, we made a conscious decision to not do that, to keep it and to keep the name. Yeah. And I think there's a general feeling that this is a sort of very carefully thought out arrangement. And in fact, I haven't looked at the emergency powers stuff since law school, and having sort of walked myself through them, I thought, my God, this is shoddy drafting. And this compares really badly to the document of 1949. Yeah. But that said, I also remember very vividly from my days at law school, which were in the waning decade of the Cold War, I hate to say, that I thought that Germans were unduly nervous and neurotic even about discussing questions, as lawyers say, de constitutione ferenda. In other words, of constitutional redesign. I always thought that that was bizarre and also somewhat hypocritical. And I think that we are going to have to head for that. I think that this tendency of this, you know, the what I call the giant, flippantly called the giant sucking sound, in the direction of the centralizing, coercive, and secret executive is here to stay. It's here to stay in all countries. We saw it surge after 9/11. And there really, I think that really puts the question of how to rebalance separation of powers, how to return the judiciary and the legislatures to their proper rights, front and center. And I think all of us have to discuss that with reference to our own particular constitutional systems. I mean, one of the ironies in this debate, and why I actually think Americans and Germans would have a lot to talk about, is that, and this may not be generally known, is that the American and the German system cross-fertilized for much longer than most people realize. The American ideals came over to Europe in the democratic movements of the 19th century. There are several German constitutional monarchic documents leading up to the Paulskirchen, the national constitution of the failed democratic rebellion in 1849, which explicitly took up some of these ideas. And then in the American progressive movement, the German ideas of the Bismarck nation state building efforts came back to America and were very widely received. The second wave of that was, of course, all the eminent German jurists who were Jewish who had to flee the Nazis and who played a tremendous role at American law schools and had real impact on American constitutional legal debates in the post-war era. And then, while at the same time, the Americans were helping us to write our basic law in 1949. So I actually think that there is a great deal of commonality there, and it would be worth discussing these issues together, despite the fact that you guys have a presidential system and a much older one, and we have a younger parliamentary one. The questions of how to, let me put it in one, if it were a headline, I would say the question is how to make our orders resilient. Yeah? How much do we need to adapt them, to make them resilient against the fragmenting forces that are battering at us? First and foremost among them, integration and globalization, which is something that we can't stop at the borders. And that's a fascinating question that we all have to face.
So Damir and Constanze, thank you. And Sam, hold your fire for one moment. We're gonna bring in one more question, and then we're gonna wrap up. Keep everybody on time.
No.
I have. Sorry to be impolitic or indiscreet. What's the word? I have a very nice written question by you, Jackie Deal, and I think you were inviting or need to convey the question, but I think you could do a much better job, more eloquently than I could. It's about German legalism, German politics, and China. So if I may, I invite you, Jackie, and then a reply, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, thanks very much, Jeff. It's an honor to be included. It was a very provocative, interesting paper, and I'm not a German specialist, so I was hesitant to raise this, but your remark about German legalism at the outset made me wonder about whether the idea of suing China for reparations would be something that's popular or very divisive. I was interested to read the Bild editor-in-chief's exchange with the Chinese embassy in Berlin, which concluded with him saying rather pointedly, you are trying to use the pandemic to advance your position globally. It will end up being the end of your regime, in a message directed at Xi Jinping. And I don't know how that, or if that will have any impact on the political contest in Germany or German economic debates about the relationship with China, but I wanted to ask about it since we've discussed Russia now and the United States, and there's the Chinese other major power seems to be relevant as well.
So Jackie, thank you. And maybe if I may suggest, Sam, penultimate, and then Constanze, final words.
Yep.
Sure. So, I mean, what I think about most in terms of that question, I'm more inclined to believe that Germany would be more cautious than to pursue something like suing China for reparations for kind of the reason that a lot of German industry is dependent on the Chinese market. And what I think about most is the German car industry, which sells a lot of cars to China. I mean, Constanze's referenced before that something I didn't know that I think the Chinese have invested a large stake in Daimler in particular. And so this kind of, I mean, one, there's the profit motivation for the German car industry, but it's actually kind of covering up a structural weakness that's there, which is basically that, I mean, the German car industry has failed to innovate and it's gotten essentially lapped by people like Tesla because they've not adapted to electric cars as quickly. They haven't adapted to artificial intelligence. One kind of anecdotal experience I had when I was in North Rhine-Westphalia was I heard of a car manufacturer who had an idea for a kind of a completely new electric car built from the ground up, since kind of the way in which cars are built traditionally is kind of made for the combustion engine, so he wanted to go at it from a different way. And he was completely rejected by the major car kind of companies, and he kind of told them, you know, to do their own thing, basically, in more polite terms. And he went and started his own factory. And so I think, you know, there will be kind of a reckoning to come over Germany's China policy, regards to politics and economics, with regards to the way in which its industry is reliant upon the Chinese market. I mean, it wasn't too long ago that it was welcomed with, you know, much excitement that BMW would be the first company in China to have a equal stake in a joint partnership. This was 2 years ago, at least. So I mean, that's kind of the background to how deeply intertwined kind of these companies are, and they make up a huge proportion of kind of the German, not only kind of industrial pride, but kind of the workforce. And so that's kind of the thought I would have with regards to how Germany would go about kind of dealing with China and the virus. I mean, you are seeing the German position for regards to China harden over time, and people like Norbert Röttgen are very outspoken on kind of China's human rights abuses, but I would kind of expect more caution than that. So over to you, Constanze.
So 2 points on that. Again, really good question. The origin story of the German coronavirus infection, patient 0, was actually a worker in a German automotive parts in Starnberg in Bavaria that worked together with a plant in Wuhan, and that received a woman visiting from that Wuhan plant and who apparently was a carrier. So the whole, you know, the Bavarian skiers just superimposed themselves on that patient 0 development. Now, Sam is entirely right that the German economy is so integrated with Chinese trade with China that it is very hard for the Germans now to act on what has very much been a hardening of not just suspicion but also of policy and of the analysis of what China's purposes are in Europe. I mean, remember this EU document that said China is a strategic competitor. I mean, I do think that the German policy establishment is fully behind that. But as a lawyer and as somebody who also did international law, I would say that a reparation suit is a little difficult because you would have a standard of proof and a standard of intention of government intent that I think would be very hard to establish, and reparations for gross negligence, which is I think where you would have to go if you were making the argument that this came out of the laboratories in Wuhan, which isn't clear yet, is really hard to do on an international level, and for good reasons. The legal precedent, I will tell you, is not encouraging. So I think that that's probably not a great way to go. I think that this one, honestly, given all the other things that we have to take care of right now, that strikes me as a bit of a distraction. By the way, Jeff, if I may add one final point,
please,
because
please.
The question about the AFD was really whether they have a path to power. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't think that they do. I still do not see the AFD as in any way establishing itself as a force to be reckoned with in a coalition negotiation on the federal level. They're just not popular enough for that. They're really tanking in the West, and I think that for that to change, they would have to have much better numbers in the West, and I have a hard time seeing that. What they are, however, is a spoiler, and a very effective and a very brutal one. And they are expert at exploiting divisions, and external powers who are all about exploiting divisions are very willing to use that, or to supplement it, or to amp it up, as we all know. And that's, as far as I'm concerned, bad enough.
Constanze, thank you very much. We're pretty much right on time, maybe just a little bit over, but thank you all for patience. In closing, Danielle, our associate publisher, thank you so much for organizing and hosting beautifully and brilliantly to the group. How impressive, and we're grateful and privileged that all of you take time. To Constanze and Sam, what a brilliant briefing. Congratulations on your fine article in Lawfare. I could add that I could think of at least one other publication that might have been a good home for such a fine piece of work, but we do love Lawfare.
Next time, Jeff.
Yeah.
So really nicely done. Constanze, Sam, and everybody, thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for hosting us. This is
thank
great.
you.
What a great group. Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Stay safe, everyone.
Ciao.